You're not losing your job. You're losing the story, the definition, the identity that told you and everyone around you who you are. Welcome back to Underneath the Title. I'm Kevin Simcock. If you're new here, this podcast is for people who've achieved what most would consider success. But somewhere along the line, they've started asking themselves, is this all there is? You see, today's episode is about answering that question. Specifically, it's about what's underneath it. Because in my experience, both from my own life and from the work that I do with my clients, that question isn't really about ambition or direction or even motivation. It's about identity. And more importantly, identity loss, which is what I'm talking about today. Despite it being one of the most common experiences among high achievers who have either exited a career or sold a business, is also one of the least talked about. So let's talk about it. So I want to start not with the definition, but with a feeling, because I think you'll recognize it long before I name it. It's the feeling you get when a major chapter in your life ends, like leaving an established career, one that you probably spent decades building, or selling a business that you spent years investing and building in, and you no longer have the title that you had for so many years. Maybe you left corporate or you left your career by choice. Maybe you were pushed out. Maybe you were laid off. Maybe you sold your business, or maybe you were packaged out because of a merger. Despite the reason, you woke up one day and that role that you had spent years, decades building was all of a sudden gone. It was over. And in the weeks or the months that followed, you started to feel something was off. You couldn't quite put your finger on it. You're the same person, but somehow you're not. You're still functioning. You're still sharp, you're still capable, but there's this sense of emptiness within you and this low energy that is constantly kind of humming within you. Then maybe you'd sit down to do work on something new, but you would feel strangely unmotivated or uninspired, like you just didn't care about it anymore. And in social settings, when someone would ask you, so what do? You get this internal flicker of discomfort, not embarrassment, something harder to name. It's kind of like there's this emptiness behind your answer because you describe what you used to do, but you know that that's no longer you. Maybe you scroll through LinkedIn and you see former colleagues getting promoted or launching exciting new ventures, and you feel some kind of mixed emotion that you weren't really expecting. You feel happy for them, but there's also this sense of oddly being on the outside looking in, like you're not part of it, that was the world that you were part of, but you're no longer in it. You feel stuck, stagnant, and you start to think to yourself that you should be achieving these things too, but you aren't. You're in kind of this no man's land. You see, all of these feelings start to culminate into one nagging thought. Why don't you have everything figured out? And what comes next? The fact that you don't know the answer to this somehow makes you believe that you're failing, because after all, you were the one that everyone came to for answers. You've always been the one who had it all figured out. That was your job. And you were very successful at it. So why don't you have the answer now? And if this sounds familiar, I'm with you, because I experienced all of that. You see, after I was furloughed from my global VP role in late 2022, I experienced all of those things. And even after being offered a global position with another company that would replace my old position, I chose to turn it down. Why? Because there was something in me that was telling me that's not who I am anymore. Now, I felt that exact disorientation, that loss of reference point. I was paralyzed by the quiet but insistent question, who am I now? And here's what I've come to understand. What I was experiencing and what many of the people that I work with are experiencing isn't a motivation problem. It isn't a strategy problem. And it isn't a confidence problem or even a competence problem. It's an identity problem. And specifically, it's identity loss. And the crazy thing is no one talks about it because success has taught us that we're supposed to have it all figured out, that who we are is what we do, that our worth is somehow measured and determined by our output. But the reality is, it isn't. So what exactly is identity loss? Well, let me define this carefully because I think the word identity gets used loosely and it ends up meaning everything and also nothing. See, everyone knows who they are. That isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about going a few layers deeper underneath that definition that you hold of yourself to find out where that definition actually came from. See, your identity isn't your job title. It isn't your industry. It isn't your income. It isn't your LinkedIn headline. Those are all expressions of identity, but they're not your identity itself. See, your identity is the internal story that you tell yourself about who you really are. And it's based on your beliefs, what you believe you're capable of, what you think you're supposed to want, what you believe makes you worthy of respect, and how you perceive yourself in relation to others. You see, for most high achievers, that story has been shaped almost entirely by professional achievement. Just think about it. From the time that you were young, the question was always, what do you want to be? Not who do you want to be? And you and me, like everyone else, answered that question probably better than most. You built something. You achieved success. You became the person that society would identify as being successful. But the problem is that over time, the story that you carry about who you are and the role that you occupy becomes so fused together that they feel like the same thing. So when the role changes, or if it ends, or it starts to feel like it's not you anymore, there's something deeper that shifts too. And that is identity loss. You're not losing your job. You're losing the story, the definition, the identity that told you and everyone around you who you are. But the reality is, most people don't know that this is identity loss. So they struggle to overcome it. But here's the part that I find most interesting and also most frustrating. You see, there is no shortage of cultural language out there for every other kind of loss. Grief, burnout, failure, depression. They're easy to name and they're easy to talk about and they're easy to find help for. But when it comes to identity loss, there isn't really a clear word for it. It gets lumped in with other feelings and often gets dismissed as something insignificant until it becomes something significant. See, there hasn't been a clear path for navigating it. And we definitely don't have a lot of visible role models for how to go through it and come out the other side with more clarity, not less. And I think there's a few reasons for that. The first is that identity loss is hard to separate from other things. It tends to show up dressed as something else. It looks like burnout. It looks like restlessness. It looks like a midlife crisis, which is a term that I find almost useless because it pathologizes something that is actually a natural and important transition. When you can't name something accurately, you can't address it accurately. And you end up treating the symptom rather than the cause. You try to fill that void caused by identity loss by chasing new roles or chasing new ventures or new titles and hoping that one of them will fill that emptiness. But it doesn't, because the emptiness isn't coming from outside. It's coming from inside, from an identity that's being untethered from the role that used to anchor it. Now, the second reason we don't talk about it is cultural, particularly in professional and executive circles. There's this strong unspoken norm around leadership and forward momentum that you're supposed to have everything figured out. You're supposed to be in control of what you're building. You're supposed to have a plan. And admitting that you feel lost or that you don't recognize yourself in the mirror the way that you used to feels like a confession of weakness. So people don't say it out loud. They keep it to themselves. And they keep acting like they have certainty, while on the inside, they're privately trying to figure out what the hell's wrong with them. And the third reason is that identity loss tends to happen to people who are, by all external measures, fine. You're not in a crisis. You have resources. You have options. You have security. You have comfort. You have people around you in your life who would reasonably say, what do you have to complain about? You have everything that you need. And that makes it even harder to give yourself permission to take it seriously. And so you bury it. You ignore it. And you treat it as just a fly-by-night feeling. But I want you to hear this. Identity loss is real and it is serious. Not because it's a crisis, but because if you don't address it at the level that it's actually operating at, everything that you build next will be built on a foundation that doesn't actually fit you. You will comfortably follow your old ways. You will do what you've always done, and that will get you what you've always had. Then you'll find yourself in the same situation that maybe you're in now, asking yourself, is this all there is? Why does this feel empty? Why am I not fulfilled? Except months or even years will have passed because you've been chasing something that was never yours. And this is what I call the identity loss loop. And I know it well because I've been stuck in it myself. So let me talk to you about what identity loss actually shows up as in real life so that you can potentially identify it for yourself. Because identity loss isn't an abstract philosophical problem. It shows up in very specific, recognizable ways. It shows up as decision paralysis because you're someone who has made significant decisions your entire career, often quickly and under immense pressure. But now you find yourself stalling on things that should feel pretty straightforward. Not because you lack information or skill, but because something inside of you is questioning if you're making the right decision. That internal reference point that used to make your decisions for you and you used to use to make your decisions has shifted. It shows up as identity performance. You find yourself defaulting to your old role or title in conversations, even when it's no longer accurate. Or you introduce yourself in ways that just slightly feel off. Like you're describing someone that you used to be rather than who you are now. Because there's a gap between the story that you're telling others and the one that you're actually living. It shows up as strange and weird, kind of awkward grief. And not grief for what you used to do, but for the clarity of who you were because of your role. The structure you had, the sense of knowing where you fit, the feeling of being recognized for something specific, and dealing with the loss of that is uncomfortable because you're not really sure you're ready to let go of your old identity and fully trust or even embrace this new version of yourself. It shows up as comparison and also restlessness. You watch other people moving, building, launching things, building ventures, and you feel this kind of inner discomfort. You're not jealous of them, but their forward momentum makes you question the lack of yours. You feel like you've stalled out and you need to keep up to them, but you can't quite work out why. And it shows up as a search for the next version of the old thing. And this one is subtle, and it's the one that I see most often. You see, people in identity loss don't like to sit still. They prefer to stay active. But the activity that they do pretends to be something new, but is often just the same old, dressed up in a new, different way. It's a new role that replicates the old status. It's a new business that you start that recreates the old environment. Perhaps it's a new project that produces the old sense of being needed. These are all common signs. Because when you don't know who you are without the old identity, you naturally reach for what feels familiar. The problem is, familiar doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Or as I like to say, aligned. Building something new on an unexamined old identity tends to produce the same pressure, the same lack of fulfillment, the same lack of meaning, only in a slightly different setting or a slightly different way. And I see this constantly, and I lived it myself. The pull toward recreating what's familiar is so strong because our egos prefer to be comfortable. Our success is the proof that tells us we are capable, and it also tells others that we are capable. But you are more than your capabilities. Now, I want to zoom out for a moment because I think identity loss isn't just a personal experience, it's also a cultural one. You see, we live in a society that is extraordinarily good at telling people how to achieve. And it's also extraordinarily poor at preparing them for what happens when achievement stops being the goal. The message that we hear from almost every institution, from school to work to the media, is this: define yourself by what you do. Build your identity around your performance and measure your worth by your output, by what you have and what you create. And for a long time that works because the system is set up to reward that. But it has a structural flaw. It creates an identity that is entirely dependent on external conditions. And external conditions change. Roles end, industries shift, bodies age, companies restructure, markets crash. And when the conditions that your identity was built around change, your identity no longer fits. This isn't a weakness. It's a design flaw in the story that we were handed. The people who experience identity loss the most are often the ones who did exactly what they were supposed to do. They were ambitious. They were committed. They've built success. And then the conditions changed. And nobody told them that their identity was built on a foundation of external expectations and how or what to do about it when it crumbles. They didn't do anything wrong. They were following the script that they were given. They just didn't realize that they could have rewrote it to fit who they really are and what they really want. And this is one of the reasons why I do this work. And one of the reasons I make this podcast, because I want to help others author their next chapter so that they can build something that gives them a greater sense of meaning and purpose. Now, I want to close this episode out with a reframe, because I think the way most people understand identity loss makes it harder to navigate rather than easier. You see, most people think identity loss is a problem to be solved. Something went wrong. Something's missing. There's a gap that needs to be filled. And that framing drives them toward premature action. They often just want to find the next thing quickly. They want to fill that silence with activity so that they can get rid of the discomfort. But here's a different way to think about it. Identity loss isn't a problem. It's actually information. It's a signal. And it's telling you that the old story that you've been carrying about who you are has run its course. That the version of success that you've been building and working toward was inherited rather than chosen. That there's a more honest version of yourself available, one that isn't dependent on titles or performance or external validation to feel real. This is not a crisis. It's actually a new beginning. The discomfort that you feel isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that you're at a threshold. And the question isn't, how do I get back to who I was? The question is, who am I now that I can choose? And that's a harder question to answer than most people think. It takes real work to answer it honestly, but it is answerable. And the people who do answer it genuinely and authentically tend to build what comes next from a completely different place. Not from proving something, not recreating from comfort or familiarity, but from knowing who they are actually and consciously choosing what aligns to that. That's what my work is about. That's what this podcast is about. And if this episode named something that you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate, that's the whole point of this podcast. You're not in it alone, and you're not behind. You're not stuck. You're just at the beginning of a more interesting question. Who am I now? Well, that's it for today's episode. And if this episode resonated, then do me a favor. Please like it and subscribe and share it with someone that you think might need to hear it. And if you're interested in finding out more, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at kevinsimcock.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.